Good morning, everybody. I'm hoping that you are all well, and I'm hoping that you are all seeing everything. This is always the part where technology tends to fail, and we have had our share of mishaps over the days of running these webinars. But hopefully, none of that happens today, and we can have a smooth go at this. So, first of all, thanks for joining us. We are today discussing about vulnerability management, vulnerability scanning, bunch of other topics that kind of go with that, and maybe a little bit more from the perspective of what it used to be versus what it is actually today. So with the advent of technologies like cloud and different kind of DevOps setups and so forth, what does it actually mean from the perspective of vulnerability scanning in the most traditional sense? So I'm Matti Suominen. Some of you know me, some of you don't. So I've been running some of these webinars from our perspective. The part you may not know is that I used to be running Nixu's vulnerability scanning services about 10 years ago. So I can give you the old guy view into what it used to be back in the day and how everything used to look. And then I have a colleague of mine who is doing the same thing today. So hopefully he knows a little bit more about what it looks like today.
Let's hope so. My name is Quinten. I'm currently in charge of the vulnerability scanning at Nixu, and I've been doing it for almost 2 years at this point now.
So we'll give you a kind of what it used to be and what it is today, and we can laugh about some of the old days and how things have changed since then. But let's jump forward. So before we go anywhere, keep in mind you can send us questions. You can use the chat functionality, so we'll try to address those questions as much as possible. Keeping in mind, of course, this is only 30 minutes or so. Usually 30 minutes means that by the time we are done rambling initially, that 30 minutes is pretty much gone. So we'll try to address all the questions we can. If you have any questions that are really good and we don't have time for those, we will definitely follow up in some form or another. So that might be another webinar if it's a complex topic. That might be a blog post. That might be just kind of following up with you if it's something very specific. So feel free to ask anything you want, and we will do our best to answer as much as time permits. And there's also, before you jump out from this webinar, there's also a kind of survey at the end. So once we get closer to that, please let us know how you felt about this, whether the content made sense, whether this kind of format is good for you, yada, yada, yada. So looking forward to that feedback as well. It's really valuable and gives us a lot of insight into how to actually develop this concept further. So let's start from a really important question, because I think vulnerability scanning is one of those things that everybody has heard about. If you work with security, if you work in IT, if you work with anything of that nature, I think vulnerability scanning is maybe the most likely one that you have encountered at some point. Most likely you have been doing it for a while. Most likely it's something that your company is doing in some form or another. And this is a kind of basic requirement on almost any kind of requirement set. You have to have some kind of vulnerability scanning in place to make sure that whether it's checking for obsolete components, whether it's checking for missing patches, any number of things. So a lot of people go into this thinking that, well, this is something I must do, and they have a varying degree of understanding about why they need to do it. In some cases, it's a really sort of good tool for doing a lot of things, and in some cases, it might not be exactly what you're looking for. So how about we start from there? What would you say is like or who should be doing vulnerability scanning in general? Who would you recommend it to if you think about like companies that we are engaging with?
Well, I mean, the main reason to do these sort of things is when you need something, like if you were looking for a sort of status update every month on the amount of targets you have or the amount of workstations or servers, and you want to have a general idea of how well patched those are, then I'd say vulnerability scanning
Mm,
is perhaps the right answer there. But obviously, you always have to watch out that when you want one of these, you actually are getting value out of them. Because you
sure.
can definitely run this every week if you wanted to, but if you're not following up on it, then maybe it isn't for you.
For sure. I think that's a really valuable lesson to bring up, is that it's in and itself, it is not doing anything. There's no actionable results from it. So just scanning, because that is the sort of first thing that came to your mind, I need to do some security, so let's do a scan. That is maybe not going to the right direction, because it is a way to find out what you need to do, not so much fix things or do any of these things that you're looking to do. So I think definitely a valid point. You also mentioned the discovery part of figuring out what you actually have in the first place. And I think, at least in my experience, that has been a key component of why people want to do this. So they want to make sure they have an understanding of what they are running, what sort of servers they might have. Are they finding anything that they don't even know they should be owning in the first place?
Yeah. Now, it very often happens that customers come up and they say, we'd like to do a vulnerability scan. And one of the first questions you need to always ask is why? What are you trying to achieve with this? Or what result are you looking for? Because if you're looking for an in-depth analysis of one target, then maybe this isn't the right thing for you, because it's not going to give back to you. But if you have this very large network and you haven't looked into it in ages, and you want to know, okay, how many things are in there, and on what ports are they running, and are there like a lot of open services in there, you get one of these in, and you'll quite quickly have a good answer on basically all those questions. So
yeah, makes sense. And I think on top of that, the how easy it is to get started is one of those benefits, definitely. So when you have one of those networks that has a whole bunch of stuff in it, I remember we used to have a lot of cases like this where the client was basically saying that we have thousands upon thousands of IP addresses that are within a office network, for example, and they didn't have an exact idea of what would be in there. They knew that for many years barely anything had been done about it. And now the question is, what should they be focusing on? Can you make like a list of things that are to some degree interesting, or a list of things that should be patched in some way? And for that, it's a very useful one, because you don't have to do a lot of preparations. You don't have to set it up in many different places. You don't have to do all of those things. Whereas if you would be doing like traditional testing, the time and investment per target might be significantly bigger. So that's also one, like, it's a good way to get started when you don't really know what to do.
yeah, definitely.
So should we jump forward a little bit, because obviously the world has been changing a lot. So we talked about cases here that are, traditional office networks or traditional data centers. You have a bunch of servers or laptops or what have you. And obviously that's a thing, so that still happens. But when we think about what the environments look today, they are in some cases, and this is of course a point we can debate and challenge a bit, but in some cases they are getting a bit more complicated. So instead of having just the set of servers or set of workstations, for example, that you would normally see, you would see a bunch of printers and these kind of things. Today it's more about cloud services, which might be running in some platform somewhere. You are thinking about industrial equipment. You are in some cases thinking about the products that the company is making. So it might be cars or airplanes. It could almost be anything. So that of course makes it a little bit different, because the truth behind what is an IP, it's not quite the same as it used to be. And then the other problem I run into every now and then, and a lot of clients are saying, is that the way they are deploying these systems is different. It's no longer about having a server that you go and you install it manually, you install a Windows image on it, you install all the applications on it, but it might actually be a DevOps pipeline sort of setup, where automation is building the server, automation is deploying the system there, automation is eventually killing it, and so forth. So it's not a server in the sense you would think about by sort of the classic standards of somebody's maintaining it and updating it and so forth. So first of all, I come from the classic side of things. It used to be much simpler back in the day. But how do you see it? Like, are you seeing companies already being in this modern world where literally they don't have any servers, or is that just a kind of marketing thing still at this point?
I mean, at this point, most of what we encounter is still, there's always still some classic remnants there. So something you do kind of see is where most of a company's infrastructure is in the cloud, that they have old backups that still need maintaining in case something goes wrong there. Um, in general, I haven't really seen anyone that is completely out of the old server workstation sort of thing yet.
Yeah,
But I definitely do see it happening. You do see it more and more that there are additional requests for, also doing scanning in the cloud, and the same sort of thing for APIs as well is becoming much more popular now. But I
for
think
sure.
the sort of old guard hasn't left yet, I'd say.
Yeah, and I guess it's a funny story in a way that back in the day, again, like 10 years ago, when typical request would be either scan the office network, which would be a set of servers, laptops, printers, what have you, or it would be scan the data center, which would basically mean a bunch of rack hardware that would be in a IP block of some kind. Even then, like we would talk about the old way of doing things and how people are modernizing and blah blah blah. So, and still people weren't doing that. So now we are getting to the similar kind of situation where it's again people saying that world is going to be completely different, and then you look at the practical situation and it's not that much different. It is going there, but it's not like 100%. It's not even
I think
50% in a lot of cases.
I think it's definitely something where leading the pack on it is something you can, some companies try and do. The issue often becomes that when you do that, tooling like this, the tooling that you use for classic scanning, is obviously much further developed at this point than all the new tools will be. So API
True,
endpoint scanners, they start existing, and cloud scanners are definitely, getting there, but they haven't had the lifetime of the classic ones. So it's much easier
true,
to get your vulnerability status, let's say, if you still have some classic items in there.
true. And I guess it's also worth mentioning that even though there might be situations where, let's say, your infrastructure is in the cloud today, obviously there is some differences between installing a Windows server on hardware or, let's say, a virtual server compared to running it in purely a cloud native environment. At the same time, though, it's a Windows server. So if you are running it in such a way that you are responsible for patching it and you are scanning it and you are realizing that you don't have those patches installed, at the end of the day, whether that's a cloud native environment or some other sort of environment, it doesn't really make that much of a difference. You still have to go and patch it in, whether it's using some automation, whether it's just manually going and installing the patches, whatever it might be. You still have to somehow do that. So from that sort of perspective, I think there's a lot of overlap still on how these tools actually work.
I mean, something that sort of ties in here as well is that it's possible that your current cloud setups are all well up to date and patched continuously and all that, but that you've forgotten to patch your actual deployment itself. So then you
Mm,
have your images that aren't at all updated, and every time you deploy a new server out there, you have to go through all the patch management again. And that's another
true.
sort of thing where if you have one, if you have that image running somewhere, you can even check that and patch it at the source so that every time you deploy that, it's already ready to go, instead of introducing a risk into your network every
Mm,
time.
yeah. I guess it's also worth pointing out that if you happen to be running an environment where you have a DevOps-like setup, so you have automation in place that does all the deployments and so forth, that doesn't really take away from running a vulnerability scanning tool, because obviously you could just plug it into the pipeline, have it automatically scan different things, and making sure that things are working the way they're supposed to. The other aspect, of course, is then scanning from the outside and seeing that are you actually seeing the kind of deployment you're expecting to see. It is not that atypical for somebody to mess up the firewall rules and other networking setups in such a way that you are actually exposing far more than you are hoping to do. And this is kind of one of those things that when you are let's say you are running this kind of automatic deployment, it is very easy to get into the mode that you configure it once, you kind of leave it be because it works, and then at some point you just make a mistake somewhere and the configuration changes. But because you're not actually like physically going and changing anything, you are not actually deploying anything physically, it is easy to forget that it's even there. So you might not go and say that, oh, actually my networking rules are wrong. They are not working the way they are supposed to. So vulnerability scanning gives you a nice way to just go and check that, am I still seeing the kind of setup I'm supposed to be seeing? Like I'm expecting one API, that's it. And am I actually seeing that from the outside, or am I seeing far more than what I expected?
Yeah. Yeah, no, it can definitely help you get a good view of sort of what's still there, and in a modern environment, it's much more likely that you get things that you don't expect in there. And someone connecting their home laptop or whatever, you can, if they have it connected at the time of scanning, you will see it and it will show up. And that's something that I think was much less likely 10 years ago, that a device like that would suddenly appear in your network.
True.
As opposed to now.
It's also worth pointing out that I think a lot of these tools are now in competition on building capabilities for cloud scanning. So if you think about like typical cloud issues, everybody has heard at some point a mention in the media or in the news about S3 buckets leaking something or another. If you look at any kind of data leaks that have happened within the last year or two, there is a good chance that somebody messed up setting their buckets in such a way that data that was supposed to be stored there only for certain applications to use, or let's say only for administrators to access, they actually failed to do so, and now everybody has access to some degree. So this is actually a nice use case for this kind of tooling, because it is very easy for the tooling to go there, check out what's happening, try to log into everything, and identify if you have any access controls that are letting the tool, access it for whatever reason. So it's a really nice fit for this kind of paradigm where you are scanning a wide range of objects and just kind of poking around and seeing what happens. So if you happen to be running an environment where the cloud side is really strong, maybe you are fully cloud, maybe you are in some sort of hybrid mode, I would say that definitely make sure that whatever scanner you are using and whatever service you are buying can do the cloud side of things. So
yeah,
not everything obviously can, but a lot of things today are starting to add those capabilities as well.
You have a lot of the classic tools are adding cloud scan functionality and API type stuff, in the same sense that at some point they all added web app scanning to their portfolio.
True.
But there are also specific scanners out there made for cloud only, and choosing between those two kind of depends on what the rest of your environment looks like. Because it's easier to obviously get all the data in one place if you use one that does both. But there are other methods around that if necessary.
Yeah. And I guess once the company grows big enough, or whatever organization we're talking about gets big enough, we start to run into situations where you have a little bit of everything. I think that's kind of the topic that, well, we are running 3 different clouds. Nobody knows exactly how many instances we even have. And then we have some traditional IT on top of that. And we have all this stuff because it's kind of organically built on top of things. So people keep adding, people introduce new tools, new environments, new platforms. So eventually this kind of solution where it's a bit more like a shotgun approach, where you're hitting a bit of everything, might make a lot more sense than just kind of focusing on, let's say, AWS specific scanning tool. I mean, it's great if you are running nothing but AWS, but otherwise not so much.
Yeah, for sure.
So should we jump forward a little bit to something you already mentioned briefly about the whole who is reporting to what and so forth. So I think that's a really good point that we might want to discuss briefly, because I remember back from the days, the biggest problem wasn't so much getting the scans done technically. Like you can scan a thing and you get a report and all is well, but actually getting anybody to do anything about it, like you get the result, you have the best scanners around, you have all these things, it works, it makes sense. But then how do you actually turn that into something actionable? How do you get a single problem fixed? That's something that I think a lot of people were struggling with back then, that how do they get, especially if it's a complicated scenario where you have a lot of different teams or companies or what have you, and you start thinking, well, how do I actually do anything? So is that something you're still seeing happening?
I mean, definitely. There are definitely clients that I've seen quite often actually that run this sort of thing every month, and every month they get a report, and you can give them the major issues, and those same reports you send every month and they haven't changed. That
Yeah,
definitely happens where you have all this information, you have all the information that you expect to get, but there's no one to pick it up from the other side, and that's one of the, I think, major issues we have here, is that you can run this all you want, but you need someone to pick up the issues that you find with it and actively pursue them. So you
yeah,
do need someone in charge of your security on your own end to pick that up, because the tool can't do that for you. It can detect, but it
true,
can't solve, obviously,
true, true, true.
um, because everyone's environment is different, and what you're trying to achieve is different.
Yeah, I remember challenge back in the day used to be that, like, reaching the actual place where the people who fix those issues, like how they are actually working. So for example, if you have a external IT company that is updating your systems, or let's say today you might have a cloud partner that is doing a lot of your infrastructure, then kind of connecting the people who are scanning, or the tool that is scanning, to the backlog of the team that is fixing things. There was always a bit of a gap there, because typically these would be happening in different places. There would be different managers and different tools being used. You would have ticketing systems, but they might be completely different systems. So kind of figuring all this out, it was a bit of a pain at times. Where do you actually even send anything, and does anybody care about it too much?
Hmm.
So one thing I find really important is that you are actually integrating to the same place where those teams that can affect the change are operating in. So you're not just sending the reports to person A, and then person B is sort of supposed to do something, but person A and person B don't really talk with each other, or maybe they don't even understand each other at the right kind of level.
Yeah, it's something we've seen a lot in sort of classic offerings. Is generally the tool does its thing, and you just export a PDF or an Excel and you send it, and
Yeah,
that's sort of all you do. Um, and that has the issues I just mentioned, where you don't know where that goes. You send it to someone and you hope they do something with it. So in a more sort of current scenario, you have specific connections between those toolings, where let's say you run your scanner and it instantly pushes all the things it finds to a Jira or something like that. um, you can get a lot further with that, because then instantly you can connect it to the right teams. The teams see the findings that are on their own sort of workflow, and they can fix it from there, as if they were just doing their normal job. They don't have to specifically get involved in the security aspect before they can do what they've always done. Um,
mm,
which is why what we can see in this picture here, this is sort of the ideal scenario that you would see currently, where you have multiple tools. They might all do different things, but the findings all still go through one place and eventually end up in the right backlogs for teams to work on. Um, and then
true.
you have experts around it can help if necessary, but you don't just have a contact person sitting there sort of parsing their own results out of it.
Mm, mm. Yeah, I remember many of these cases where things actually get really wrong when you're sending those results. It might be within the organization, it might be with an external vendor, could be either way. So you're sending these to somebody somewhere, and it seems like nothing is happening. And then at the end of the day, you realize down the line that whomever was receiving those, they didn't really understand them. So there wasn't anybody to kind of tell them what it means, or there wasn't anybody telling them, whether they are fixing it right. So you just kind of send somebody a note saying that please fix this issue. We are seeing problems here, please fix it. And that person doesn't know how to do it, or they do something and they think that maybe it fixed that, but it didn't. So having that dialogue there and having those people available to say that, oh, actually the problem is not really what you're thinking about, but it's a little bit different. So you actually have to go and fix something else as well. Otherwise, this is not going to resolve itself.
Yeah. There's a lot of times where sort of findings and vulnerabilities are connected in a sense. So you can have eight things show up, and actually one fix can do all of them. But also the other way around might happen, where there's one issue, but actually there's a lot of causes for it.
True.
And you know that's something you always will run into. But it's important to have someone there that can assist in those specific cases. Because some of the issues you will face is that the output from whatever tool you've chosen to use might not fully explain to you how to fix the problem. It'll say the issue stems from this area here, but it won't say this is what you do to resolve it, because
Yeah.
In many cases, again, it's not always the same solution. So
True.
that's the kind of thing where you would like someone to be able to assist you.
Yeah. And I think this is getting even more difficult when we think about the old versus new picture. So, you know, back in the day when you had a server, it's a physical piece of hardware running Windows. Okay. So you can get the instructions for how to patch it, and 90-something% of the time that might actually go well. If you do it, it's going to work. Now, if you think about today's environments, it's hard to say whether you are deploying it through some cloud setup, if you are building the image through some automation, if you are manually setting it up. Is it even a system? Is there even a computer directly behind it? Is it I don't know, it could be anything. It could be a Lambda function there. It could be almost anything. So giving those instructions automatically, it's getting even more difficult because the scanner doesn't know enough about your environment. It doesn't know how you are building the environment or how you are supposed to patch it. Are you even supposed to go on that machine and patch it, or are you supposed to deploy a fixed machine instead? So that's part of it. Somebody has to understand what the environment looks like and how to apply the findings to that, which actually takes us to our last point regarding whether or not you actually need somebody to help you. So I think a lot of companies are doing this with a partner. Others might be doing it on their own internally. And at least my feeling always was that there's a lot of benefit to be gained from having somebody who is experienced with that particular type of scanner, as well as all that goes with that, instead of just doing it internally. So what's your take on that? Have you felt that it's useful to have somebody to spar with?
I mean, the added value is, of course, that when something goes wrong or you don't understand the finding, you have someone there with the knowledge to help you with it. So absolutely, you can buy just a tool and have it run in your environment and just put one of your developers on it and say, okay, you're in charge of this now. But
Yeah.
you will run into the risks of potentially not knowing what to do there. I'd say
Yeah.
it's always smart to have someone that knows about security in general, and also specifically what these sorts of tools can give you. Whether you take an entire company in arms for that, or you have someone internally they've specifically hired for the purpose, that can also work. But you should always have an expert in it that can help you with those things. That's sort of my take on it. Anyway, I think there's definitely a possibility to say, okay, well, we're going to hit a bit of a rough patch, and we start out with someone that doesn't really know, what the results are going to be, but eventually they'll learn. But you never know if you've configured it right until you ask someone that already knows if you have.
True. We are pretty much reaching the end of the time, and there's a couple of questions there. I'm checking if there's anything that we would have time to briefly cover here. There might, I would say that these are questions that might take a bit more time to cover. There's a there's there's really one that is a really good one, and I don't want to cover it here because it's a complicated question. So basically, the question is that what would you do in case you had a setup where there is no legacy? And I think this is a brilliant question because this comes up every now and then. Usually it's a startup or it's somebody who's building a new product and they have nothing, they have no IT infrastructure and they're just starting from scratch.
Yeah.
I would suggest that we cover this in a separate session or a blog of some kind because it's a complicated topic. You have to sort of build it up from scratch and give a couple of options. We could easily fill another 30 minutes on that. Let me take that as an follow-up question, and we will definitely come back to that because it's a brilliant question and definitely worth exploring a bit more than what we have time for.
I think one question we can answer is, are there issues to consider with a cloud provider so they don't consider your scan an attack? Absolutely. And basically, most cloud providers have specific authentication tools for this purpose. So you can request a token specifically to let them know who you are and that this is okay. You definitely don't just throw the IPs in and go, because then it will be an attack. So there is a lot of extra things you do have to set up before you do something like that, but it's definitely not an issue.
Agreed. Unfortunately, we are out of time, so as usually happens, the 30 minutes is really quick, and we could talk about this all day. Hopefully, there were some useful thoughts and points to you. And before leaving, please give us some feedback so we can get an idea of whether this was useful or whether you like the direction this is taking. And we will definitely follow up on all the questions we didn't have time to cover. And I absolutely want to get into the whole how do you build a startup from scratch topic. It's worth exploring on its own for sure. So thank you, everybody, and have a good day.
Thank you.